How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 45th video channel, and today we're going to be finishing our 5th book, The Three Ecologies by Félix Guattari. Last time, we looked at how our author conceptualizes subjectivity, and what he calls ecologic, setting the groundwork for today's episode, where we'll actually delve into the organizing principles of, well, the three ecologies. This is going to be quite a dense video, so I recommend watching the first two in the series if you haven't already. The link to the playlist will be in the description below. With that out of the way, Guattari begins this part of the essay by stating that there is a principle common to each of the three ecologies.
Each of the existential territories with which they confront us is not given as an in itself, closed in on itself, but instead as a for itself that is precarious, finite, finitized, singular, singularized.
Essentially, in other words, no territory is an island. If you don't remember, this term corresponds to one of Guattari's four functors, essentially referring to all those components that make up the self, from the home to relationships with friends and family. To return now back to the text, everyone has borders where they connect to others. In another work, I believe Chaosmosis, Guattari describes this in terms of existential territories interfacing with incorporeal universes. Another of his four functors that refers to all the possibilities that can be realized in the form of territories. To use an example from In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, this can be seen in how eating a madeleine sweeps the narrator away from the territory of the current moment to that of a house in Cambrai. Keeping this general principle in mind, Guattari turns his attention now towards mental ecology in particular. Here, he says that the specific principle is that
its approach to existential territories derives from a pre-objectal and pre-personal logic of the sort that Freud has described as being a primary process.
To explain, Freud's primary processes refer to those of the id, driven by pure flows of desire that aren't restrained by reality or morality. For Guattari, the object of mental ecology is a kind of proto-subjectivity that exists according to this logic, not limited by things like inhibition or divisive organization, or to individuals. At this point, he turns his attention towards phantasms, what I'll call fantasies from now on. In psychoanalysis, these refer to the ways in which wishes are fulfilled using the imagination. For Guattari, any ecology that explores fantasy must first take into account the whole expressive framework that gives rise to it. In other words, the assemblages of enunciation that are involved. To explain, assemblages of enunciation are basically collective systems of meaning, desire, and so on, that exist independently of individual minds. As Guattari says concerning the work of Gregory Bateson,
he has clearly shown that what he calls the ecology of ideas organizes itself into systems or minds, the boundaries of which no longer coincide with the participant individuals.
Fantasies don't exist in a vacuum. Instead, they are the precipitate of a myriad of heterogeneous elements that exist beyond the constraints of single individuals. Like we talked about last time, these assemblages are constructed through asignifying ruptures that destroy existential territories just to rebuild them through the introduction of new ritornelles, those repetitive refrains that hold the identity of territories together. To take something of a step back, a signifying in this sense refers to how elements that usually mean and construct one thing are blown apart to be used in new ones. The question of mental ecology concerned with these ruptures can emerge essentially anywhere. To try rein them in, different approaches have been developed. For example, Freud made use of what Guattari calls the rituals of accession, like theory, association, and interpretation, to create stabilizing ritornelles that realize specific models, a psychoanalytic incorporeal universe, if you will. Other approaches exist, however. For example, what Guattari calls post-systematic tendencies in family psychotherapy make use of new scenarios. However, these still fail to appreciate the proto-subjectivity of mental ecologic. Because of their industrial scale, they still act to restrain the creative proliferation of subjectivity. In Guattari's eyes,
whether they be myths or theories with scientific pretensions, the relevance of such models to mental ecology must be decided by two criteria.
These are their capacity to recognize the points where rupture occurs, and their use of autopoietic, that is to say self-determining and regulating, concepts. Freudianism meets the first, but not the second, and vice versa for post-systematic approaches. Guattari's aim is essentially to rethink these practices in light of criteria like the ones just mentioned. The point being not to tally them up against science, but rather to explore what he calls their aesthetico-existential effectiveness. In other words, how they paint new subjective landscapes. In his eyes, asignifying ruptures lie at the heart of his effort. Guattari argues that ritornelles and other such agents of redundancy produce the proto-subjectivity introduced at the beginning of this episode. In other words, they act as the catalysts for the development of subjective formations, setting down their groundwork as it were. He links this to Freud's discovery of the partial objects, although sees the way they are tied to bodies as problematic in its lack of scope. In his eyes, there is no reason for an object involved in existential production to not be architectural, economic, or even cosmic. What matters, though, is that the bifurcations they produce can never be properly represented. As he says,
these focal points of creative subjectification in their nascent state can only be accessed by the detour of a phantasmic economy that is deployed in a random form.
There's always something that slips out of view, something virtual, like what makes a home feel like a place of belonging, for instance. Attempts to map them out are instances of what Guattari calls metamodelization, an idea we'll undoubtedly explore later on when we get to his book on schizoanalytic cartographies. It's here that he moves on to discussing the praxis of a mental ecology. Essentially, it must involve working out what to do with fantasies, especially negative and dangerous ones. In his eyes, abreaction, defined as the acting out of a fantasy or trauma, is necessary in order to stop the drifting away of existential territories. However, this doesn't mean that it has to be done violently. Rather, Guattari sees it as possible to achieve the release of fantasies by what essentially amounts to a redeployment of sorts. An example of this can be seen in the work of the Marquis de Sade, who turned negative and, sadistic fantasies into what Guattari terms quasi-baroque ones. Here, another of Guattari's breaks with Freud is apparent. He doesn't see the existence of a death drive as an intrinsic given. Instead, he says that violence and negativity are the result of specific assemblages of enunciation. Refusing to deal with negative fantasies, as occurs in what Guattari terms intolerant and uninventive societies, just causes them to surface as violence. Guattari is quick to add that he realizes it's not possible to completely remove the violent and negative elements of fantasy. However, he hopes that the expansion of institutional psychotherapeutic practices, like those found at his clinic Le Bourd, could possibly restructure the problem itself, so as to begin to undo the damage caused by what he calls integrated world capitalism, a pervasive force in our post-industrial world that seeps even into the most unconscious layers of subjectivity. On this note, he moves on to social ecology.
The principle specific to social ecology concerns the development of effective and pragmatic cathexis in human groups of differing sizes.
This cathexis or investment corresponds to a group Eros of sorts. To explain, Eros in psychoanalysis refers to the life drive, that force which compels people to work on self-preservation, pleasure, and so on and so on. For Guattari, the group Eros isn't just different in a quantitative way from an individual one. In other words, it isn't simply the equivalent to a sum of multiple small cathexes where individuals invest desire into each other, but rather it is qualitatively distinct. In other words, it has a completely unique texture as it relates to mental ecology's proto-subjectivity. Here, Guattari distinguishes between two types of group: personological triangles and autopoietic subject groups. The first, as seen in things like the Oedipus complex, pictured here, involved what Deleuze calls refolding, an operation that Guattari sees as developing subjectivity through a closed system of identifications, impoverishing it in the process. For example, in the Oedipus complex, the child can only identify with the father or the mother, often producing a serialized subjectivity. That's to say, a subjectivity built around an external object. For example, with the child, the father as an object of hate for standing between it and the mother. Moving on to the second type, subject groups, they refer to singularized subjectivities that open onto what Guattari calls the cosmos and the socius. For our purposes, these can be described in a somewhat simplified way as vast unfamiliar incorporeal universes and the social body respectively. Going further, the personological triangles are symptomatic of a mass media age, creating pliable subjects whose existence is necessarily limited. In the case of subject groups, on the other hand, is here that stock identificatory systems are instead replaced by what Guattari terms diagrammatic traits. These are related to, yet also opposed to, what Charles Sanders Peirce refers to as icons, a sign that has a direct resemblance to the thing signified, like an image of a bike representing, well, a bike. The difference between diagrammatics and icons is that the first are much more deterritorialized. That's to say, they don't really imitate the referent, but rather engage in a signifying rupture. These traits are defined by their ability to break away and form new discursive chains. His example being of the transference of style from a piano teacher to a student, which has the ability to bifurcate in a myriad of heterogeneous directions. Moving on now to a more general level, Guattari distinguishes between collective assemblages of enunciation and imaginary group aggregates or crowds, essentially being collections of subject groups and triangles respectively. Whilst the former is defined by autopoiesis, the latter is instead characterized by an empty repetition. There is not the same creativity involved, just the same alienated serialized actions being stereotypically repeated. Like we touched on earlier, an autopoietic system, at least in the sense Guattari uses the word, is essentially defined by its ability to self-regulate and self-determine. It's thus that, unlike blindly repeating pre-existing circuits like the Oedipus complex, assemblages of enunciation are, in a sense, essentially more active. However, returning back to the text, Guattari says that the distinction between these two types of group formation isn't all that clear-cut. Certain opinionated parts of a crowd may bifurcate, while subject groups revert back to serialism. In his eyes, a major player in the fate of these groups is the media.
An essential programmatic point for social ecology will be to encourage capitalist societies to make the transition from the mass media era to a post-media age.
Essentially, Guattari is arguing for the media to become focused on singularization, rather than serialism. Instead of organizing itself around external objects treated as other, thus creating personological triangles, the media should, in his eyes, instead embrace the heterogeneity of subject groups and their autopoiesis. It's important to keep in mind that Guattari is perfectly cognizant of the fact that this might all sound a bit impossible at first, or even utopian. However, he argues that the alienation the media produces isn't a necessary fact of life. Instead, it seems like it is on account of what amounts to a mediatic fatalism. In turn, this fatalism is the result of a number of factors, such as but not limited to, firstly, an ignorance about the possibility of raising mass consciousness, something that the rise of online activism has proved to be more and more poignant and harmful. Secondly, the failure of socialism in the USSR, which, as Guattari argues, simply opened the door to new opportunities for social struggle, rather than spelling the end for radical politics. Thirdly, an absence of understanding of how technology has made it possible for the media to be used for anti-capitalist ends, since it's no longer limited to big corporations. See, for example, the rise of alternative media, which has proliferated across sites like YouTube. This is all connected, finally, to lack of clarity on how the birth of new labor systems in the early 20th century began the creation of new subjectivities through things like skill transfer, training, and what Guattari describes as retooling. To skip ahead a bit for the sake of time, Guattari remarks that the problematics or objects of social ecology can appear often quite difficult and quite fuzzy to approach, something that is a direct result of the heterogeneous ways the post-industrial era has impacted subjectivity and identities. To give an example, there has been something of a rise of archaisms, as people try to hold on to the past as a way to defend against the massive transformations that define our era. Sometimes, this tendency to hold on to the past can work out for the better, for example acting to strengthen the singularity of certain groups, but other times, and must be said more often, it can prove problematic. His example is of the fascism of the Ayatollahs in Iran, something that came into power through a popular revolution. To deal with things like this, he says that a social ecological praxis must focus on developing new existential territories to replace former religious and ritualized frameworks. Guattari is clear that he isn't proposing some kind of general model for society, but rather is simply supporting the acceptance of new singularizing value systems. Adding on, these existential territories don't have to be tied to things like an old country of origin or homeland. In fact, doing so often causes more harm than good. Rather, there are all sorts of places where new territories can be established, from art to music. As Guattari himself states,
what condemns the capitalist value system is that it is characterized by general equivalence, which flattens out all other forms of value alienating them in its hegemony.
It's thus that social ecology must endeavour to break out of this system, to rediscover what is heterogeneous and singular. It's for this reason that the creation of new modes of valorization is more important than ever before. And on this note, Guattari shifts his attention to the laws of the three ecologies.
There is a principle specific to environmental ecology. It states that anything is possible, the worst disasters or the most flexible evolutions.
From natural disasters to COVID-19, nature has shown itself to be a powerful and often dangerous thing. However, as underlined again and again by Guattari, it doesn't exist at all independently from human development. As he goes on to say, the equilibriums of nature have become more and more reliant on human activity, from global warming to mass deforestation. To expound this idea, he states,
We might just as well rename environmental ecology Machinic ecology, because cosmic and human praxis has only ever been a question of machines, even, dare I say, of war machines.
It's important here to remember that the way Guattari, and by extension Deleuze, use the word machines is in a much broader sense than usual. Essentially, everything that couples and interacts counts as a machine. For example, to borrow from the Psychoanalytic Cartographies, a book we'll cover at some point in the far future, there was a machine formed from the operation behind the moon landing and JFK, each element comprising its own machine, along with being conglomerates of small machines themselves. In this way, the world is essentially a massive mechanosphere, one giant machine composed of a myriad of heterogeneous components, all interacting and affecting each other. Nothing exists inside a vacuum. It's all connected. To conclude with the broad lens, as he says,
Rather than remaining subject in perpetuity to the seductive efficiency of economic competition, we must reappropriate universes of value.
In other words, the goal of ecosophy is to break out of the homogenization of capitalism's form of valorization, like those of the imperium that we touched on in the first episode of the series. We must, in essence, find new ways of singularization and consistency for their results. Giving an overview of the three ecologies, Guattari states that this is only possible through considering the nascent subjectivity of mental ecology, the constantly mutating socius of social ecology, and the reinvention of an environment that falls under machinic ecology. Through the application of these lenses, to almost borrow his words exactly, individuals will become both more united and increasingly different. With an ecosophical praxis, subjectivity will be able to gain its edge, and singular creativity will gain a foothold against serialism. As Guattari writes,
Hence this essay, which sets out, in its own way, to counter the pervasive atmosphere of dullness and passivity.
It's with this that Guattari concludes the three ecologies. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at Judith Butler's understanding of gender as it relates to melancholia. Until then, bye!